So in this lesson, we're going to look at the organisation and structure of the League of Nations. If you remember, the League of Nations was the 14th of Wilson's 14 points. Let's read at the bottom actually. This is a postcard that was produced at the time, a memorial postcard for the establishment of the League of Nations. So a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Really, the whole point of the League is that it's going to protect the interests not just of the big world powers, but of the great and small states, big and small countries. The League of Nations should look after their interests too. Something called the Secretariat was established in London in 1920. I remember the Covenant had been established in 1919. That was the rule book of the League of Nations. And the League first met, the Assembly of the League first met at 1920 in Geneva in Switzerland. So what were the aims of the League of Nations? Well, here are 4 of the aims. One of them was that the League was supposed to stop wars. The League was supposed to be an international body that would help to sort out any disputes between countries and would deal with aggressive countries by all of the members of the League acting together to stop any problems, and to be a place where nations could come and discuss their problems and the League would help to sort them out fairly and peacefully. Another of the League's aims was to improve the living and working conditions of people all over the world, so that they lived healthier lives and safer and better places to work. The League was also intended to encourage international disarmament, so countries all over the world would reduce the sizes of their armies and militaries. Remember, the arms race was one of the contributing long-term factors of the First World War, and the world had just come out of the horror of that war. Last of all, it was supposed to enforce the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, to make sure that countries stuck to the agreements in the treaty. Let's look now at the structure and organisation of the League, and you should copy this diagram down into your exercise box. So one of the League bodies was the Assembly. This met once a year. All members of the League of Nations had representation in the Assembly, so it was quite democratic. 47 members, that was the 47 initial members of the League, were in the first Assembly, and every country was represented in the League Assembly. It didn't meet very often, however. It met once per year, the League Assembly, and its powers were somewhat limited. It could decide on some issues, such as membership of the League. Something else about the League Assembly was that all decisions in the League Assembly had to be unanimous. That is, if the League was going to take any decision that the Assembly had to vote on, it had to get 100% of the votes for the League to take any action. Now, in a way, this is a good thing. It means that any decision taken by the Assembly, all members of the Assembly agree. However, it's in practice very difficult to get member nations from many different nations with many different interests all to agree on something and to vote all together. Another part of the League was the Council, and it's been placed above the Assembly for a reason. This consisted of more powerful and dominant members of the League, and obviously the USA wasn't there, hadn't joined the League, and neither had the USSR. So the League Council, when the League was born, consisted of Britain, France, Italy and Japan as permanent members. Other non-permanent members were there on a changing basis every year. Germany would later join the League Council too. Now this met when necessary, so this is going to be the thing that really responds to crises in the world, the Council, not the Assembly. This met on average about 4 or 5 times a year, and this really was where the real power of the League lay, with the Council, not with the Assembly. Like the Assembly, though, any decision that the Council took had to be unanimous. That was because any member of the League Council could veto. So if one member voted against a decision, it wouldn't get passed. Again, this could potentially stop the Council from coming to any decision which is against the interests of any member of the Council. They could use their veto. The Secretariat of the League was the civil service of the League. You've got a clue as to its functions when you look at the shape of the word Secretariat. It looks like secretary. It was the office workers, the paper workers of the League. They would do things like arrange meetings and do all of the paperwork. This did have a problem though, because it didn't really ever have enough members. So it took a long time to do anything, to process the paperwork. It was very slow. The Secretariat was rather slow. There were other things that the League of Nations was associated with. These were the commissions of the League of Nations and the committees of the League of Nations. And this is where the League did have some measure of success, as you will see. So, what commissions were there? There was the Mandates Commission. This was supposed to look over the mandates. Remember, the former colonies of Germany and Turkey were supposed to be looked after by Britain and France until they could achieve independence. So the mandates were supposed to make sure that Britain and France looked after the needs of these areas rather than the interests of just Britain and France. There was also the Disarmament Commission. The aim of that obviously was to ensure that countries around the world disarmed. And the Slavery Commission. This certainly did meet with a lot of success. And slavery was still a significant problem in the world of the early 20th century. Committees of the League. These actually survived the death of the League of Nations when the League of Nations failed, and they're now part of the modern United Nations. So the Health Organization was one of the committees of the League. Again, you'll see it had some success. Now it's called the World Health Organization. There was also the International Labour Organization. This was supposed to ensure fair working conditions around the world. And that's, again, still with us today as part of the United Nations. Criticisms of the Council. Well, if you remember, the first four permanent members of the League were Britain, France, Italy and Japan. So 3 of the 4 permanent members of the League were Western European countries. So it could be criticised as being a European club. How can it be representative of the world when 3 out of the 4 members of the Council are Western European powers? Britain, France and Italy. It could be accused of a measure of racial discrimination. In fact, a Japanese delegate at the the Treaty of Versailles tried to get an anti-racial discrimination clause into the covenant, into the rulebook of the League of Nations. But this was opposed by Britain and France and Italy because they were worried that if there was an anti-racial discrimination written into the code of the League of Nations, into the rulebook, the covenant, then the fact that they run as empires, that the Western white European nations run these non-European colonies, they control them, could be threatened potentially by an anti-racial discrimination bill. The colonies were traditionally in the past seen as the white man's burden, that somehow these civilized Western European nations were looking after these colonies until they were ready to look after themselves. A somewhat patronizing and slightly racist attitude. Absent powers in the Council. The USA was intended to be one of the founding members. The USSR was missing from the League. Germany also, so significant powers were missing from the League of Nations. How could it claim to be a world power representing the best interests of the world with the power to enforce that if it's lacking these very important nations? This is something that Newton Roswell of Canada said at the time. You may say that we should have confidence in the European statesmen and leaders. Perhaps we should, but it was European statesmanship, European ambition that drowned the world with blood. He's basically saying, okay, you're saying we should have confidence in the Council of the League, but it's dominated by European statesmen. And it was Europe that dragged the world into the horrors of the First World War. A critical weakness of the League was that the United States didn't join. It was supposed to be a member of the Council, so that chair was empty at the Council. Wilson was a Democrat, and the opposing party to the Democrats dominated the Senate of the United States, in the United States government. They were Republicans, and the Republicans tended to be more isolationist. they didn't want America to get involved in old world affairs and wars. They thought America should look after American interests and not spend American lives and money on wars in Europe, for example. And the US Senate prevented America from joining the League of Nations. Let's look at this cartoon for a moment. Look at the title of the cartoon, Looking Our Way for a Blood Donor. So they're using this metaphor. Down here you've got this old man. And this old man is supposed to represent the old powers of Europe. What does it say here? Bloodletting, the only remedy they know. This is a metaphor for the wars that have frequently ravaged across the European continent. And it's the metaphor being used is that of bloodletting, an old medieval medical practice where people used to basically cut open their veins and bleed into buckets. This was supposed to be a cure in the medieval times. And they're using this as a metaphor for war. This cartoonist is saying old war, bloodletting, i.e. warfare, is the only solution that Europe seems to know to deal with its problems. And look what the figure of Uncle Sam that represents America is saying. You can continue your archaic remedy, your old-fashioned remedy, if you want to, but don't depend on me for the transfusion. The point of the cartoon is, why should America spend its blood and treasure, its lives and money on a war on a different continent when it doesn't need to get involved? It's got this ocean in between. The absence of the United States greatly weakened the League of Nations. This is a point made by Marcel Cachin, a French politician. The defeat suffered by Wilsonism, that's the absence of the League of Nations, strikes at the very existence of the League of Nations. America's place will remain empty at Geneva, and the two countries that will dominate, France and Britain, are divided on almost every one of the topics to be discussed. So Marcel Cachin is saying, look, America's not a part of it, and France and Britain, the two main powers, they hardly agree on anything. So how's the League and the Council really going to get anything done? Here is a contemporary American cartoon. This is an American cartoon which is clearly against America joining the League of Nations. So this figure here, this top-hatted figure with the stars on his jacket and the stripes on his trousers, this is Uncle Sam, which is frequently used to represent America. And you can see he's not in a good position here. His hands are tied together and they seem to be pulled in different ways by England over here, foreign nations, European nations, the Empire of Japan. They're saying, this cartoonist is making the point, if America joined the League, her hands would be tied, her independence would be gone, she would be within the control of these foreign powers, so she shouldn't join the League of Nations. She'd be pulled about by the desires and the ambitions of these foreign powers outside the United States. Here's a cartoon, a British cartoon, which criticises the absence of the United States from the League of Nations. Here, the League of Nations is represented by a bridge. It says here, this League of Nations bridge was designed by the President of the United States. You can see Belgium's there, France is there, England's there, Italy there. But the keystone, and that's the most important part of the bridge in the middle. Without the keystone, the bridge will collapse. It cannot work. The keystone of the United States, again, the figure of Uncle Sam is used to represent the United States. The keystone is missing. So this cartoonist is saying the League of Nations cannot possibly work without the United States. The exclusion also of the Soviet Union, another large world power. If you remember, it had been excluded because of fears of things like the Comintern, which wanted to encourage worldwide communist revolution. So some significant powers missing from the League of Nations. So I hope that you've made a note of the structure of the League of Nations and that you have made enough notes to be able to do the quiz. Good luck.